Hi everyone, thank you again for joining me for another episode of Live Your True Story. This is your host, Mioke, and it's just gonna be us today. I wanted to give an introduction and a little bit of background on a series of interviews that I'm going to release. And slowly some others will trickle out as well as time goes on. I mentioned that some changes are going to be going on with the podcast, and in a sense, I'm sort of trying to maybe marry the vision of a podcast that I had a long time ago, forever ago. So I wanted to sort of set the scene for that. This is something that I began, I don't even know what year, but it was shortly, I believe, after I started drinking ayahuasca alone in my apartment in 2013. And I can't even tell you how isolated I was and how few people I knew and had contact with at that time. It was pretty lonely, but also I was pretty distracted and consumed by the constant torture of scleroderma and the illness that I was undergoing. And I'm about to actually get back to my book this fall and revise it to get it out to the world, where I talk a lot about this time in my life. I mean, I was essentially trapped in my body in a bed, bedridden, with a commode and all those fun things, grateful that I wasn't still living in a hospice. I had all these thoughts, and here I was drinking medicine, and I was starting to feel better again. I wasn't functional by really any definition, I think, by anyone. My caregiver at the time, who I hope we'll have on, who's an indigenous Nepalese person, struck gold, right? With that, she had an inherent understanding of ayahuasca, because there's, at least from the outside, when she witnessed me on it, it reminded her of things that the Goombas and different Rinpoches and the holy people in her land, which is a melting pot of various spiritual traditions. It was familiar to her. She'd seen people purging and all of that and going through various, perhaps visionary states. I think this is something that they don't really share with Westerners, really, that these holy people are engaging with them, and outwardly they'll often speak against them because they see that our culture is not really using them in right relation. But these are very deep aspects of these traditions. So anyway, so I was doing my own makeshift ceremonies in my apartment at the time and going into these very intense visionary states without any diets, without any Icaros, and just trying to clean out as much of this illness and all the trauma that I was carrying. And from the get-go, I was one of those people who had some pretty intense visions and still trying to make sense of any of them. But in any case, in that period of my life, I basically just saw my caregiver every day, and I didn't really have the energy to speak. I don't think I could sit up for longer than 30 minutes at a time, which I would do to eat because it would take me so long to eat. So she would lift me up from the couch so that I could be in a sitting position. She would put my pillow on my lap and my, bowl of oatmeal or whatever it was that I was eating at the time. Sometimes she would have to spoon feed me. Other times I could do it for myself. So it was rough. It was not a good look. But as I began to feel better, one of the ideas that sort of came to me on the medicine was to start my own little podcast where I could, have some sort of connection with the outside world, because I had really stepped outside of time. So that sort of kept me in the world, if only in the abstract world of ideas, but it gave me this opportunity as well to read books and talk about books, which is something that I love to do, and talk about the ideas. And at that time, I had no inkling that I was going to be writing. And so I was mostly like having these high visionary states. It would connect me to something. And I was fortunate enough to have access to two of the three largest libraries in North America. There's the Library of Congress, which I did not have access to. And then after that is Harvard University. And after that is the Boston Public Library System. It is huge, the Minuteman Library Network. And so I would get these really obscure texts from the library and try to understand what it is that I saw in my ceremonies. And in many cases, it validated what I saw and gave me some sort of lens or way to articulate, and often some context about what I was seeing. And so this was sort of like a mad scientist. I think of it as like a mad scientist period of my life where, yeah, I mean, I really had no one to bounce these ideas around. These were, as I mentioned, I didn't really talk to many people, but none of those people that I had talked to had even heard of ayahuasca until I mentioned it. And they were all confused, like, so you're going to die and you're like tripping alone in your apartment, like this is pre Michael Pollan, this is pre all that stuff. And so I was kind of trying to intuitively and instinctually figure this stuff out for myself, and it was just sort of making sense. But I wasn't in any position to understand it and explain it to myself, much less anyone else. But in this time, something started to open. You might call it a mystical side, which had been severely shut down. Any notions of spirituality had really been locked up for decades as a knee-jerk reaction to my evangelical and abusive upbringing. And so in a sense, it's like mission accomplished with that whole system. I see a lot of people in general who grow up in those really difficult environments where there's spiritual abuse. And that is super deep. It's deep in the way that sexual abuse is deep. And I mean, often they aren't separated, right? Like you see these cults and it's everything, and as above so below. And in that sense, I think that the spiritual realm is the higher octave of the sexual realm, which is why you end up with so much of this in the spiritual space, which is one reason that I like diets. And I like the idea of dieting because it does require so much celibacy as you encounter these higher and higher states and teachings of spirituality, and kind of open to what I might describe as the ancient psyche, or maybe even the original psyche, if such a thing exists. Some people might call it the collective unconscious. So I was having these direct, very powerful encounters because, again, I wasn't drinking like regular ayahuasca that you get at retreats. I was drinking the most intense, purgative, insane ayahuasca, not knowing that there were different kinds of ayahuasca, but that's what I started with, and I had no idea how to dose myself. I was taking way too much, but I was getting a lot out of it, and I was traveling. For somebody who couldn't leave her bed on her own, I was traveling farther than so many people. And actually, I have a short story. Not a short story. It's an essay, but I mean, I write sort of in a literary way. I write in a novelistic way, even when I'm writing memoir. And I wrote this piece called Rear Window, and I'll post a link to it, because when I was living in this building, as I started getting better, I started to be able to move about this giant 2-block sprawling apartment complex. And it was, Section 8, and it was filled with a lot of characters and just like the most random assortment of people. Boston has a really interesting mix of histories of people who come together in particular ways, and just like as the elites kind of have someone from every country and, royal blood and all of that. When you go to the opposite end, to people who are very impoverished, you end up with a pretty interesting mix of people. So I would say that the mixture of people that I lived with were older people or middle-aged people who had gotten sick like I did in some respect, or just were so locked up in a way. I mean, there was a woman who walked around who was like in a perpetual L shape. When she was standing up, her body was just at this 90-degree angle, and she had this, I think she was Dominican, and she was older, and God, she was sweet. And she could barely get around, and she had this cane that she used, but she got out, and she was so sweet. Whenever I had something manageable, something small, and even something large, she would get her little basket roller and put my package in there and like take it in the elevator up to the 5th floor, the top floor of the building, and knock on my door. And she didn't want my packages to get stolen because she knew I was a messy wreck upstairs. So there was this real neighborly feeling there. There were some really wise, amazing souls. And like, I'm so into old people. I love old people, especially people who sort of live outside of the mainstream. So like, I had a lot of black neighbors, one guy who is like an actor in blaxploitation films. There was another beautiful black woman who had been an actress on Broadway. There was an old woman who was like in her 90s, and she was so elegant and so intelligent, and I think she was even half Native, and I write about her in this piece as well. And so it's like people sort of like that. There was a dude who was like a backup singer forever from Patti LaBelle, and every year she would send him like some giant birthday cake and stuff, and yeah, it was wild. Some really wild neighbors there. And so we had like sort of that classification of people. Like, I was the only Asian. I was the only person who wasn't like black or Hispanic or white. But another large population in that building were Russian Jewish scientists who were sort of rescued from Putin and were taken in by the US government. Which is something that the US government does. If you look up histories and stuff, like, we took all the Nazis, like the actual Nazis, as well as the scientists that the Nazis were trying to kill. I think like we took a Nazi to run NASA for a long time, not a Jewish person, but an actual Nazi. But I lived with these old Jewish people who ran their own labs in Russia and the US, and they were just of all stripes. I mean, there was a dude there who was a scientist who was there at Chernobyl, and he told me how he took care of himself, and he's super old too. And it was like, damn, after that kind of radiation. But he showed me like the stuff he did to clean his body out every day. Like, it was just a wild experience when I think back to it. And so I always kind of wanted to write about that building, and I named the piece Rear Window after my absolute favorite Hitchcock film, closely behind some others. But oh God, I love Rear Window. It's such a character study of neighbors. And so in that spirit, I named this piece, and I'd sort of been sitting with it for 3 years. And then one day it just like popped out, I think, in like 2 days. I wrote it in 2 days in like 2 4-hour writing sessions. And then I spent like, I don't know, 3 months getting the first paragraph right, because that's how writing works. You just kind of like, okay, let's stumble our way into this. And then you find the flow, and then you're like, God, but how do I get the beginning to get us off to the right start? And in it, I talk about my favorite of these Russian Jewish scientists, who was just amazing. She was so sweet. I just loved her. And I don't know, she was wild. Like, she told me she was psychic. She had this crazy backstory, this heartbreaking backstory. And I think I've mentioned before just how talking to different people just shifts your politics and kind of takes you out of the sort of pre-packaged viewpoints that people have, especially when you travel and you look at things from the perspective of other countries or people who come from different countries, not just like ethnicities, but other places in the world. And I remember, like, I was still there when the Ukraine war started. I was like, there was like this whole, like, everybody hated Putin, and it was like Putin, Putin, Putin. And I was kind of like, what do you think about Putin? Like, what do you think about all of this? And she was like, yeah, I don't like Putin. Putin's not a good guy. He sucks. That's why I came to America, because he sucked so bad. But she was like, no one hates Jews more than Ukrainians. And then she told me this really heartbreaking story. It just infuriated me because her father had died fighting as a soldier, very young. And he's buried in a Jewish cemetery in Ukraine. And then her mother, she never remarried, and she lived to be very, very old. And apparently her mother was super, super smart. I guess she was Lithuanian, if I remember correctly. And, like, the Russian government, like, took all their stuff. And, yeah, it was wild. Her mother just was, I forget what she was. I think she was a scientist, but in another area. So, anyway, my neighbor was saying that when her mother died, like, I don't know, 50, 60 years after her father died, she was cremated, and then they had put a beautiful urn that was attached to and, kind of was above her father's grave. And at some point, she said some vandals in Ukraine went in there and broke the urn, and just so much violence. I mean, I haven't heard of anything like that, except for what the U.S. government does to the grave sites of Native Americans. Like, it's really, really haunting and so dark to do that to the dead and to the living. But so then you have my neighbor, who is just this genius. Like, there's no other way to say it. She just was this genius. She got her PhD at the age of 23 in St. Petersburg. And one of the reasons that she had to leave was because, man, if you're a famous scientist in Russia, I mean, you can check out the guy who invented the theremin. There's like an amazing documentary about him. And then his musician partner, Clara, who played the theremin like nobody else. I mean, just wow. Like, I don't think she'll ever be topped in terms of theremin musicians. But, in any country, if you're a genius scientist, watch out, because you are going to be weaponized, which is, what happened to, obviously the Jews who came here from Nazi Germany and so forth. But she was telling me that she used to work in a secret lab, and she snuck out. They were doing some of the earliest LSD experiments, maybe the earliest LSD experiment in Russia, and they're just trying to figure it out. So there was this secret. It was like, just a handful of scientists, and she was the only lady because she was such a goddamn genius. And there were also like these nefarious actors because, she had these grad students and stuff, and I think she had like thousands of patents, hundreds of patents. Like, she patented toilet paper. I don't know. It was really a certain kind of toilet paper. It was really crazy. I took a picture of her somewhere. I'm trying to find it. I took a picture of her holding up all of her patents, and it's just like, wow. She had all these papers and wrote many, many books, which she no longer has. It's when she left, it was just with a suitcase and her daughter, and like they had to get the hell out of there. She was able to grab some of her patents, though, and here she was living like a pauper with no real claim to any of it. But this is somebody who should have been a gazillionaire. And you hear about this with there's like a documentary called Bombshell with an old Hollywood actress who was chewed up and spit out. And Hedda Lamar. It's sort of a scourge in a way. I mean, I feel like nobody feels sorry for beautiful women. But it seems like it's been in the past for women who had conventional beauty or, just stunning beauty, who were insanely intelligent, that it was very, very hard for them. It's difficult to be an intelligent person in a beautiful body that just, that's not what the world wants from you. But my neighbor described when she snuck out a hit of LSD. She's like, I want to know what we're feeding these mice. Like, what's the big deal about this stuff? And so she took it on like a day off, and she got to travel. Like there's this other Russian guy that I saw. He's called the Mad Russian, and you can Google him. He's a wild dude. He's an energy worker. And, he was famous for helping people quit smoking with just one session. And the guy was a trip because he just blasted you with energy. But he couldn't just have people pay $85 or whatever it was, blast you with energy and send you on your way. He kind of did this whole theatrical thing, and it was super fun. It was kind of amazing. It was like watching a Dostoevsky character do like a little one-man show. And he told us about when he was living in Russia. And he was like, in Russia, we were trapped physically. We could not move. If you wanted to take a trip from your home in St. Petersburg to Moscow, you literally had to find somebody with, kind of the same economic class and everything who wanted to come to St. Petersburg for the same time frame. And you could like house swap. But that was like the only way to travel because they didn't have like commercial hotels and all of that kind of stuff. And then you had to file so much paperwork so that the government knew where you were at all times. And so he was like, we were physical prisoners in that system. And he said what was so interesting when I came to the US is I saw that everyone could move physically. They could move about freely, but it was their minds that were prisons. And so he told us about when he was in the war and he was a pilot and his plane went down. And when his plane went down, something happened to that guy. He touched on something. And he began to cultivate that. He stopped eating after 5 p.m. He started to kind of do some of those overlapping things that people dieting and that yogis do, and just fostering and cultivating this energy. And I kind of imagined it as like he was in another room that had like a lot of static, and he just like rubbed his feet on the carpet for like an hour and then like blasted you with it. But he definitely had this energy, and it was pretty interesting. It was a pretty deep, energetic shift, and he was more successful at helping people quit smoking and other issues than any other kind of smoking cessation product on the market. But he was quite famous, and he had this little office in Brookline, and people would come from all over the world. Like when I went, I was the only person from Boston there. People were from Tokyo, they were from places in Europe. Someone flew in from Hawaii for this guy, and people kind of tried to study him or whatever, and there were obviously skeptical stuff. He has like a book out, it's pretty wild, which is why I read about a lot of his sort of philosophies. But that was quite a show. But she got to leave Russia in that LSD session. That was her awakening, just like him going down in the plane. Like, she got to touch ground, so to speak, on a place other than Earth, the place that she, or at least what she knew, what was known to her. And that shifts people forever in their human journey, which is why I think these medicines can be so powerful and why so many people take advantage of them. One of the things that I've noticed when I talk to, just therapists in general, but people serving these medicines, is that they are too afraid to go do ceremonies. Like, they say they're not ready yet. And it's like, then why do you think you're ready to hold space for medicine? Like, it's just, it's super crazy to me. And I find that that's like the rule. Like I personally, of the many retreats that I've been to, haven't met anybody. I've heard of people who go and work with the Shipibo and ground their medicine work with the Shipibo. But yeah, this is another reason that I'm like, be really careful who you're having hold space. Like, this is why I say, like, even if it's like ketamine or something, like, make sure they're grounded in an indigenous tradition, because these are people who are like too afraid often, and they can maybe hold it so that you have a quote unquote good experience or whatever. But yeah, there's something that's like not in alignment with that for me. But in any case, thank you for wandering down tangent after tangent with me. So when I did my podcast, which I called at the time Philosophy of Health, because I was still a big philosophy nerd and still kind of am, but in a different way. My understanding of philosophy is very different now. I've heard it said, and I agree, that philosophy is the common sense of 400 years in the future. And that seems to be the case. You have these people with ideas. You have this, for example, with King Sejong in Korea. He called in 500 scholars, his top linguistic scholars in the 1500s, 1400s, and designed this, the most intelligent writing system. And this is also a podcast that I'll try to release with this linguistic professor. And, they designed an alphabet for their language, which is unique, actually. I mean, the only other alphabet that exists like that is Cherokee, but everybody is using some sort of second-hand alphabet or character structure that was actually built for a spoken language that doesn't exist anymore. Like, this is why the alphabet's so weird. This is why, like, the letter Y can be a vowel and a consonant. It's because, like, yeah, this alphabet was created to speak Phoenician, which isn't a thing anymore. And German, Latin, all these other languages were built, just appropriated these alphabets. We're using, renovated alphabets. It's like a, fire station that was converted into condos or something, and it's just like, why is the bathroom here? Like, oh right, because this used to be a fire station. This building wasn't built for a bunch of humans to live in. So at this time, when I was doing these podcasts, I was so alone. I was super, I don't even know if it's suicidal. Like, I was definitely thinking about euthanizing still, because I didn't know if I was going to get to somebody who knew how to use this medicine. Like, at that time, it's like, how would I ever get to Peru? How would I ever get to, like, a real medicine person? I can't even, get to my bathroom. So at that time, it was very dark, but I sort of found this reawakened spark from these incredible experiences that I had, in which there was, like, also just an enormous amount of purging with a body that just didn't have much energy at all. And I wrote about my first experience with ayahuasca in a Michael Pollan anthology that's also available on my website, where my writings are. So when I first started drinking, it was like I was doing this sort of like Herculean physical thing with the medicine, with this incredibly potent ayahuasca mixed with these insane visionary experiences, just alone, with no one who could understand to talk to about them, seeing many visions of things that I didn't believe in, things like reincarnation, or just even the concept of the soul. So I would read these books as fast as I could, which wasn't a lot because reading would really tire me out. But I'd read these books and just try to be a good student, because like I always wanted to be such a good student. And then I would interview, and my interviewing skills, just like any skill, like improved over time. Like, interviewing is hard, like the greats, the Terry Grosses, the Howard Sterns, they make it look easy the way pros do, but it is hard. There's a lot that you have to learn, not just about the technical equipment of like what a mic does that makes things sound so unnatural, but also just how we speak. It's just not a conversation. Podcasts are a performance of conversations. And this is why so many people who are really popular podcasters are also comedians. Like, they are people who are skilled at a form of public speaking, or journalists, right? And with comedians, it's like, yeah, these are people who are on stage all the time. And just like comedy, it looks like they're up there just talking off the top of their heads, but these are very refined performances where they have carefully gone over the language, and these things are written and they're timed and they're performed the way an actor does a script. Anyway, so this is what I was doing at the time, and I stopped doing it in 2017 when I entered my MFA program to get a master's in creative writing, which was an interesting experience. But I did get to bang out quite a bit of my second book with that. Gave me many insights into the artistic process and what is wrong with so many people, and like really like what is wrong with MFA programs and why that generates like its own kind of AI writing. Like, honestly, people in MFA programs, they just have this kind of AI writing. It's really weird. Before the days of AI. So this was sort of at the end of that, where I read this amazing book by Peter Park, and it really rapidly accelerated, in many ways, my healing process, which ultimately, a good deal of my healing has been the journey of decolonization. And it's a bit of an issue because that word is so politicized, and it is inherently political. But I feel like this is something that's happening inside of the institutions right now, and different people of color, quite honestly, have been allowed into the institutions. This is why they wanted to keep so many of us out, because we come in and we access the same information, but we have different points of views, and we're looking at this collective blind spot that white and whitewashed history has protected for so many years, for centuries, for millennia. You know, this colonizing history. And I mean, but this is one of the things that the first people who were colonized in the West were the white people. You know, they went after the Jews, they went after the pagans, they went after the witches, and the medicine people who had their own cultures and their own lineages throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. And that's just so far in the distance that people have lost connection, and so then they want to like usurp these other traditions that remained intact. When I read this book, because my whole field was philosophy, and because I was pretty brokenhearted when I got sick that I wouldn't be able to become an academic, before I realized that that really wasn't what I wanted to do. I just like having access to the toys, but I want to use them for completely different ends. I was always like that. I never really went to college with a career in mind, except to be a professor maybe, but it was still just because like if I thought that if I were a professor, I'd be able to do other things and continue to learn about the things that I was interested in, because I didn't realize that you could do that anyway, that there were other ways of doing that. So he dismantled this story for me, and it was something that I maybe had touched on, but there wasn't any rigorous scholarship on it. It was just kind of people shouting, and maybe it was coming from something instinctual, but there wasn't any evidence for it. And so this dude was the dude who brought receipts and really validated certain things that I intuitively sensed and that I noticed about different professors that I had who specialized with certain philosophers. Like, not even professors that I had, but professors that I knew about who I really stayed away from because they were fascists, like so clearly. and just like classists, real gatekeepers, like really look down on the people, on lower classes, anyone who didn't come from some sort of like elite whatever. Just like these weak little men who knew that they would be nothing if it weren't for these cadres of little young students following them around and telling them how great they were because they were young people who didn't know anything else. So it was really great. And then to learn this author was also Korean, I was just like, oh, that's kind of cool. But I noticed that like he, had this great book that really started a lot of the decolonization process in philosophy that has begun to happen. I hope to have him back on to kind of touch base on his book. It's like, hey, 10 years out, what do you think? What's happened? What's going on? What do you see? And then when I had Paulette Steeves on, the Indigenous Canadian author, who's doing this in archaeology and not working in like the 1700s, but working in like 2 million years ago time frame, archaeological time. Like their books were sort of spiritual siblings in a sense. So now I'm really interested in finding maybe other texts that do something similar in different academic disciplines. So if you know of any, I'll check them out if you send them my way and maybe try to have the author on and have a conversation with them. But yeah, I mean, in my education, I read a lot of books that I really didn't want to read, but have stayed with me and were so informative in my healing process to be able to understand in a conscious way what it is that I was doing, what it is that these plants are doing, to understand the system of the plants, things that I'm able to integrate between what for me has often been untranslatable from how the Shipibo view things, because I'm not Shipibo. But the deeper I go with the plants, it's like the more I'm also learning from the same teachers at the Shipibo. And so I am kind of getting some of that information, but I'm filtering it through my experience and my understanding of the world from my little corner of the universe. Yeah, but I just kind of wanted to share some background of when I was talking to Peter. I think I did close to 40 interviews with some pretty interesting people 8 to 10 years ago. And so I'll start slowly releasing those because they were really, really interesting when I think back. But I took them off because when you're healing, it's kind of like children. Like when you're doing this kind of work, it's important to not be public when you're in certain parts of the process, just in the way that like you shouldn't really have child actors and stuff, because it's like you should just have that protection and that privacy to develop, to make mistakes, to have your awkward phases or whatever. At that point I was just healing from so much and separating from my family and really having a 10-year reckoning of my life. And yeah, I didn't feel good about having all this stuff out there. And like sometimes you just don't want people in your process, like authors are often not posting like their first drafts of stuff because it's like that's the whole point of publishing. It comes from the word public. You're putting it out into the world, publicar. So I didn't really want them out there, but now I kind of feel like, oh, let's go back and revisit these. And, I edit them down a little bit and put them out there, especially as they complement some of the people that I'm speaking to now. And so I have this series that I did. I didn't do any other series. It's just that, like, man, this book that he wrote was so incredibly dense. Like, it's philosophy, and philosophy is just like, it is just like, unless you're reading Nietzsche, it's like the worst thing to read. And so I, read it, took notes, but I was like, there's no way we're going to talk about all this stuff in a single episode. So it's a 3-series episode. The first one will be free, and I'll have little bits of the second and third portion up. But yeah, whenever you see an episode that says archive, that's what it's from. It's from my first podcast. that I attempted to do. And it was a great learning experience. I didn't have any setup. I didn't have any money. I was like eating like minus one meal a day so that I'd have money for my prescriptions and stuff like that. It was like that. So I had like this $20 microphone that wasn't great. And then I don't know what happened to it. I think it broke. And so the third episode, I sound a little bit like I'm in the bottom of a well. But yeah, it's a great conversation. And I was super critical of myself back in the day. And everything just felt like super cringy. It was like, Pen 15 episodes times a million. And now that I'm looking back, I'm like, oh, they were all right. Not bad. Like, it's okay. It's okay, Mioke. You're right. So I'm happy to release some of these things out to you as I'm able to sit down and revisit them and have some more people on and read books. I will be calming down a bit in the fall because I'm going to be focusing again on writing my memoir. But I'm always happy to learn about interesting people and people that I might want to talk to because I ask super weird questions and it's fun. I'm always interested in talking to people for very different reasons than I think other people want to talk to them. So maybe during that time when I'm focusing on my book, I'll put up more from the archive and you can see maybe my growth, I hope, as a public speaker and as an interviewer. I do have to edit less these days, edit out the ums and all those things, but no one's ever accused me of being a smooth talker, that's for sure. I hope that you enjoy this interview series that's coming out and future episodes that I put out from another life before I could walk or smile. So, thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you on the other side.